Welcome to Crowning, the weekly show where birthing is a portal to your power. And I'm Siobhan Duras, a birth and spirit worker based in so called San Francisco, California. And I show parents how to alchemize their fears of childbirth and rise as the leaders your ancestors have been praying for. Welcome, welcome. I had a little bit of email and tech mix up, so we'll see who joins us live today because I basically forgot to share and promote it. But if you're here, thank you. Hello, say hi in the chat. And it's not too late to drop questions into the Spirit Doula hotline if you have any. The intention of this show is to connect with one another, connect with, oh, it's a little spider or something. Um, Connect with your intuition, your creative power, connect with evidence based resources, um, and to inform y'all on what's happening in the world of birth and reproductive justice, as well as my goal to leave you empowered. This show intends to share things that are um, informative and by nature in a universe that the birthing universe and uh, all of the things that touch birthing here in the US, unfortunately, is connected to a lot of upsetting things and potentially triggering things. And so, before I proceed, know that today's stream is going to have mentions of obstetric violence, that's violence at the hands of doctors in hospital birth. Um, as well as mentions of sexual abuse. And so know that the way I design this space is intended to hold that with care, is intended to put your nervous system first. So let me first put up here our rainbow of readiness so you can assess for yourself if it's a good moment for you to receive this information. The Rainbow of Readiness is a little system I created inspired by the work of Accountability Mapping, who developed a rainbow of tolerance based on the work of Lindsay Brahman and Dan Siegel's window of tolerance when it comes to just assess. This is a gentle self assessment for the type of information we discuss here. And so if you're underactivated, feeling things that are typically associated with depression, maybe you're feeling a delayed response, a emotional withdrawal, or feeling very shut down today, you're welcome to stick around. However, in the 2 to 4 zone is where optimal functioning and growth can really happen. And similarly, on the 5, being overactivated, if you're highly anxious, if you are having difficulty focusing, tears or rapid speech, and maybe in an emotionally activated place, you may also want to come back later with what we're discussing today because, boy, do we got stuff to discuss today, okay? I'm going to take a sip of water. Today, this is the best. This is obviously nothing here is sponsored, but this is the best coconut water that I splurged on today. Because that's just where I am. Maybe I can fix my problems with a $5 coconut water kind of day. And you know what? Sometimes it works. So now, thank you. Hey, Vibecaster. Thanks for sharing in the chat where y'all are at. And as I said, just content warning. There will be mentions of obstetric violence, of sexual violence, and no details, but just mentions of it, which are unfortunately almost in our current world have become somewhat intrinsically tied with the conversation of birthing. And so know that I create this little system to assess for yourself, because I think that engaging with this information is important if you, especially if you plan to support or give birth yourself. I don't want to ever shy away from the realities because I think it serves us to understand it. However, I think it's important to be mindful of our body experience. If at any time you feel like you need a break, just hit pause and join me back later. With that said, I invite you to take a few breaths with me today and just arrive here. Let's see. I uploaded a little bit of gentle music, and let's just ease into it today because, as I said, there's information that upset me today, and it's things that there's a part of me that wants to say I'm not surprised. There's a part of me that needs to stay surprised because I have to believe that there's a better standard of being in care um, and being in movements together. This is my goal with crowning, is to be a resource for the reproductive and birth justice movements. And I have a lot of commentary on the things that we're going to look into today. But first, wherever you're at, inviting you to just pause with me for maybe 3 minutes. Clear out anything that you may have brought with you to this moment. Exhaling anything that you don't need for this duration that we'll be here in space together. And I'm going to take 3 breaths with you, beginning with exhaling all the extra energy with a big inhale through the nose. So an audible sigh, letting those vibrations awaken the channels, open the channels, taking a second breath in. Intuitively placing a hand on any part of your body that might need a little extra care today. And today, it's right here, one of my favorite decks, the Offerings Oracle by Caitlin Grania. And the card, the offering that the spirits of birthing want from us, is silence. So I'm going to take a moment of silence for the next minute. Just be here in silence together. Thank you for joining me in that minute of silence. It's to be with ourselves, be with our breaths, and then I sprayed my little field shield, I call it, which is a spray rosewater being the most pronounced thing, but then I have a flower essence in there. And spraying it, reaching you, let this cloud of clearing mist reach you. Breathe it in. Smell the roses. And I just fade that music out, and it's kind of nice in the background. Let me know if it's distracting or if it's too low to even be noticed. But I got it at an 11 here. So, all right, today, as I mentioned, I had some tech hiccups, which included my prep document, which I thought I had. So I had to kind of scramble to pull up the links again, but I already know the things I want to talk about today. And so the first one that's really on my heart is this statement from Dolores Huerta, which was issued today. And so if you don't know who that is, she is a big a celebrated and well-known leader in the labor rights movement, especially in California, relating to farm workers' rights. And she is typically associated with the farm workers movement that is often credited to Cesar Chavez. And today, Dolores Huerta issued a statement regarding that. And so I'm going to read it and share it. And again, as I've said, there is mention, this is a mention of sexual abuse. And there's a reason why this is relevant to us here, and I'll get into that. But I wanted this to be a moment to be informed in a loving space, and to honor her story as somebody who feels it's part of my calling to honor the stories of women, of people who are not women, of non-men, so inclusive of trans, non-binary, gender expansive people. And so I'm just going to read it. So this was just released today. She said, I am nearly 96 years old, and for the last 60 years I've kept a secret because I believed that exposing the truth would hurt the farm worker movement I've spent my entire life fighting for. I've encouraged people to always use their voice. Following the New York Times multi-year investigation into sexual misconduct by Cesar Chavez, I can no longer stay silent and must share my own experiences. As a young mother in the 1960s, I experienced 2 separate sexual encounters with Cesar. The first time I was manipulated and pressured into having sex, and I didn't feel I could say no because he was someone I admired, my boss and the leader of the movement I'd already devoted years of my life to. The second time I was forced against my will and in an environment where I felt trapped. I had experienced abuse and sexual violence before, and I convinced myself these were incidents I had to endure alone and in secret. Both led to pregnancies. I chose to keep my pregnancy secret, and after the children were born, arranged for them to be raised by other families that could give them stable lives. So if you are drawn to read more of this statement, I encourage you. It's here shared on her own Instagram with a complete article that I won't go into now, just out of respect for those viewing to decide if you want to read further. But this felt really, really important to bring up today because of the specifics of what she shared. So actually, let me just keep that up here for y'all. I'm actually going to stop this background music. So, in general, one, I've mentioned before here that I grew up in a labor a family involved in the labor movement, specifically Irish labor organizers in San Francisco. Also, my grandfather did work in LA, and they are notable and fairly well known leaders in this organized labor movement. And so that's something that I personally grew up knowing and understanding and hearing the names. Not they're not farm workers. Um, and this was, Cesar Chavez was not in San Francisco necessarily, and so there isn't I don't have a connection specifically to this, but that I learned as somebody who grew up in a family that very identified as union people, as I got older and began to learn more and read more about not only labor studies, but also listening to voices beyond that. And one thing I learned was um, how many people were left out of the labor movement, specifically undocumented people. And as then I also was taking and learning more about Filipino American history, I learned a lot about the participation and leadership of Filipinos in the farm workers movement that have never been recognized. And when we hear about the United Farm Workers, often it is credited to Cesar Chavez. And I remember reading long ago that there were sentiments of mm, the just nuances and complexity in how many organizers, and the reason I mentioned my own relationship with labor unions is because I know it applied as well to Irish organizers in the Bay Area, um, where men were getting credit and people to get these contracts, labor contracts, and organize, oftentimes it included um, exclusion at best and often violence and um, feuding with people who either were not aligned with this movement, this specific movement, or people who or undocumented people who would be the other end of folks who would receive the work that organizers are fighting for contracts for and organizing to get, I don't know, to collective bargain and have workers' rights and have contracts with, I mean, those who hire workers. So I said before, that's why there was a part of me that was not surprised, but I think the part that felt really compelling to share on this today, not only had to do with my shock, my own shock and my own need for processing in community in a space like this, but she's talking about how this what really stood out to me is the power of uplifting a hero in a narrative like a movement, a hero whose reputation extends so far and is so important that other people suffer to this degree. Imagine for 60 years, she has kept this a secret for 60 years and has given two children to adoption. So this to protect the reputation of one singular leader, which movements are not built by a singular person. And this is the danger, I think, in our colonized culture of the hero narrative is that one person gets uplifted to being beyond human and is builds a culture where people believe they need to be they need to be protected from any criticism, and at what cost? And we see here at the cost of a highly celebrated and well-known figure hiding for 60 years that she was put in a position to feel that she needed to make the choice to give her children and be separated from her own babies. And in episode 1 of this show, we talked about the pillars of reproductive justice, which are the right to have a child, the right to not have a child, and the right to parent our child in safe environments. And it just feels so heavy on my heart, and it feels like this is a moment in this collective reckoning that we're experiencing, as patriarchy and late stage capitalism um, crumbles before our eyes. This is very important to me. And so, just speaking love and solidarity to Dolores Huerta, to the two children that she was separated from, to everyone else who came forward in this, as it says, multi year investigation into sexual misconduct by Cesar Chavez, and to every person who's felt that they had to stay silent to preserve a movement. And I feel deeply emotional right now because I have been in situations where I felt that silencing my own interpersonal experiences was essential to protecting the harmony of a larger unit. And I think many of us can relate to that. Even if you haven't experienced something as horrific and violent as this, my guess is that those that watch and are part of this community we've built here in this little online corner can relate to the feeling of needing to abandon yourself to preserve the peace. And that is directly um, related to sovereign birthing and our body autonomy and this general culture of being told that others' needs come before our own. You know, she describes in this statement saying that she arranged for them to be her children to be raised by other families that could give them stable lives. And that will definitely need to be a future episode, digging into adoption and this story that children are better off given to people with more resources rather than resourcing their parents to keep families together and to support the livelihood of families, um, and shedding this story of who deserves to parent and who, um, yeah, just who deserves to parent. The fact that we pull away children from their mothers and give strangers money to house them and feed them. Um, as someone whose one of my parents was adopted, um, it's an under it's an under recognized form of violence that lives in our bodies, and that is going to continue to be a theme today, of what it is that we inherit, how things live in our body, and to me, most importantly, here today, what our ability is to change that, because that is where I find my power, is in the belief and the proof that because we've inherited circumstances, because the patterns of what our mothers, grandmothers, and all our ancestors had to do to survive, or did choose to do to survive, that doesn't need to be our story. And that rewriting our stories is powerful, in narrative alone, and also looking today at the evidence that exists showing us that there are measurable and um, evidence-based ways we get to rewrite our narratives and what that can really do in changing our DNA altogether. So, taking a breath to release the heaviness from the heart. If you're feeling that with me, I'm personally feeling that reading this. This angers me. Um, and I think it also needs to be named that any person with a holiday we should be skeptical of, or skeptical of the motivations for that holiday. Um, I won't say be skeptical of the person because there's also figures like Dr. Martin Luther King, who was chosen as the face of the civil rights movement, who we know was targeted by the FBI, and that's what this is a propaganda centered country. Everything relies on propaganda. And the stories, again, like they think about when we talk about our ability to change our stories and therefore change our experiences, I think we have proof of that from the culture, the overculture that utilizes story to control um, the public, to manipulate the public. And one of those stories is the story of the savior and the hero, and that if if a movement is built by hundreds of people, that recognizing that this does not serve empire because it acknowledges collective power. And so instead, when we look at the farm workers movement, we choose one person to be the figurehead of this, one person who can be uplifted as a savior, because not only does it create a narrative of waiting for one savior to come, which as if my brain is already thinking about the story of Jesus and how that is so foundational to Christian culture and the puritanical Christian culture we all have to exist within here in the US. I think about even Luigi Mangione, is who is people are so excited to lock in on one person, one savior that's going to defy our like Christian narrative of us being all like inherent little sinner flawed people. But if there's this one superhero that can come in and save us, then we, rather than building collective power, will then spend our energy looking around, waiting for the next savior to rise. And when that savior comes our way, um, in the case of Cesar Chavez, not a perfect person, in fact, a verifiably harmful person who then is protected by the narrative. And as Dolores said here in her own words, she believed that exposing the truth would hurt the movement that she spent her entire life fighting for. So here's our moment to say there is no movement for liberation built on the backs and the wombs of the women who have been forced to choose between their sovereignty and truth and dignity, um, and the collective liberation and movement of the people they care for and the causes we care for. And so matriarchy rise. And to be clear, when we say matriarchy, we're not talking about a women supremacy. culture. We're talking about a culture that centers children, that centers those who create and nurture of all genders, um, and mothering, mothering expansively and creating the conditions for life to thrive. And if your movement does not create the conditions for life to thrive, for families to stay together, for women to be sovereign and heard, we don't want it. And so my eyes twitching and saying move on from this. But thanks for listening, because to me this is an important day in our movement for liberation's history to discover the the fullness of what our movement ancestors experienced, represented, perpetuated, so that we can be better and rise with more equitable and loving loving movements. So that's that. Ringing the bell there on my heart. Taking an exhale. Taking a sip of water. And the second story today, spoiler alert, also upsetting. And so this is Cherise, Doyley. And this, actually, let me remove my screen real quick while I open up, let's see. This article today, I'm going to skim through it. I think all of the articles today. I'm really just going to kind of do an overview and not read into it as much as I typically do, just to let y'all kind of investigate for yourselves. But let's see here. I also want to talk about a situation that I came across, continuing our conversation the last couple weeks about the escalation of hostility in hospitals. Today we're going to look at the story of coming out of Florida. So let's see. We'll read this one more in full. Okay, so again, content warning. This is going to discuss obstetric violence. So the title of this article is "They Didn't Want to Have C-sections. A Judge Would Decide How They Gave Birth." So on the afternoon of September 9th, 2024, Cherise Doyley was in her 12th hour of contractions at University of Florida Health in downtown Jacksonville when a nurse came in with a bedsheet and told her to cover up. A supervisor brought a tablet to Doyley's bedside. Gathered on the screen were a judge in a black robe and several lawyers, doctors, and hospital staff. "It's a real judge in there?" Doyley asked the nurse at the beginning of what would be a 3-hour hearing. "Now this is the craziest thing I've ever seen." Doyley hadn't asked for the hearing. The hospital had sought it. Doyley had mere minutes to prepare. She had no lawyer and no advocate, no one to explain to her exactly what was going on. Judge Michael Khalil informed her that the state had filed an emergency petition at the hospital's behest, not out of concern for Doyley per se, but in the interest of her unborn child. The hospital and state's attorney's office wanted to force Doyley to undergo a cesarean section. Doyley, a professional birth doula, didn't want that and had been firm about it. She'd had 3 prior C-sections, one that resulted in a hemorrhage, and hoped to avoid another serious complication and lengthy recovery. She was aware the doctors were concerned about the risk of uterine rupture, a potentially deadly complication for her and her baby. She would say during the hearing that she understood the risk to be less than 2% and didn't want to agree to a C-section unless there was an emergency. But the choice would not be hers. The judge would decide how she would give birth. So let's see if you can, I think you'll be able to hear this if I play it. Let me know if you were able to hear that audio, but this is a Zoom call. This is here in the middle is Cherise in her bed laboring. And let me tell you, 12 hours of contractions is not that long for um to require intervention if the only reason was that she has had prior C-sections. And many hospitals have this policy that if you've had a C-section before, then they will just say you need to have a C-section again. And so it does take some self advocacy and self empowerment through education and resources to have what is typically referred to as a VBAC. There are also HVACs, and so those VBAC stands for vaginal birth after cesarean. HVAC stands for home birth. Why am I saying HVAC? I'm tripping. Is HVAC? What is? I need to Google these. HVAC is the air conditioning. I'm like, why am I saying HVAC in my head? HBAC is a home birth after C-section. So, acronyms, y'all. There's so many acronyms in the birth world that have outside context. Another one that comes up a lot is when people refer to themselves as FTMs, which in the birthing community can mean first time mom. But if you're queer, FTM usually is associated with something different, maybe female to male transition. So that gets often confusing in the birth world when people say they're FTM. You gotta clarify sometimes. Anyways, completely sidetracked. Back to this. She's on 12 hours of contractions. The typical laboring window for a first time parent, which this is her fourth birth, it sounds like, but it is in the 12-hour range. 12 to 24 hours is very common for laboring and contractions. And so for her to be on hour 12 and then to then put her through a 3-hour Zoom hearing to force a cesarean is truly absurd, because let's also remember the fact of, by your rights of bodily autonomy, you can decline an intervention even if it means you might die. People decline chemotherapy. People decline blood transfusions based on religious reasons or just because you don't want one. And so what we're seeing here, and mind you, Cherise is coming out and sharing her story now. These stories are gaining traction, but this actually occurred already almost 2 years ago. So let's continue reading. Mentally competent patients typically have the right to choose their medical care or refuse it. But there is one notable exception: pregnant patients. That inconsistency is particularly striking in Florida, a state that has pushed to expand medical freedom for those who wish to avoid vaccines or fluoridated water while constricting the rights of people in various stages of pregnancy. There aren't any other instances where you would invade the body of one person in order to save the life of another, said Lois Shepard, a bioethics expert at University of Virginia School of Law. In Florida and many other states, court-ordered medical procedures are just one of the ways pregnant patients' rights are restricted. The effort to chip away at those rights is rooted in the concept of fetal personhood, that a fetus has equal and in some cases more rights than the woman sustaining it. This dates back to the 1980s, when courts started ruling that hospitals can override patients' decisions in favor of the health of unborn children. In the years since, proponents of fetal personhood began to push for even broader legal protections. In 1986, Minnesota was the first state to recognize fetuses as victims in homicide cases. Some states have imprisoned pregnant women for exposing their fetuses to drugs, and nearly 30 states have passed laws allowing hospitals to invalidate patients' advance directives, which outline the kinds of life sustaining treatment a person wants after a catastrophic illness or accident. At least one, Alabama, extended the concept of personhood all the way to the earliest stages of fertilization and conception by giving frozen embryos the same legal status as children. Florida has been at the forefront of these policies. C-sections, let's see. Okay, the state attorney's office for the Fourth Judicial Circuit declined to comment on this case, saying a response would violate her medical privacy. Really, having what was this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people, 8 people on a Zoom while she is naked and laboring was not a violation of her privacy? Okay. But in an email, a spokesperson noted why, in general, the office would intervene. The courts have held that the state has a compelling interest in the preservation of life of an unborn child and the protection of innocent third parties who may be harmed. Let's check in then on Adriana Smith, whose baby was born in Georgia. I'm going to pull this up right here because we're talking now about my phone is ringing. The state has a compelling interest in the preservation of the life of an unborn child. Yeah, says here, cases like this where it's slow laboring or prior C-sections, the need for surgery is less clear. So thank goodness we can see Doyley here, Cherise Doyley, that she did end up being forced into that cesarean. Thankful that she is alive to tell her story, especially after having a history of hemorrhage after C-section. So this whole thing is just getting into the escalation of policies that put the rights of fetuses above the rights of the people carrying them. And there is no clearer example of this abomination than the story of Adriana Smith, who, if you aren't familiar, was the woman who was declared brain dead after a medical emergency, and they kept her on life support for months so that her baby would be born. And this article from December says nearly 6 months later, the baby remains hospitalized. So she was not living, and the baby weighed 1 pound and 13 ounces once born. She was declared legally dead in February, and the baby was born in June. So it's sickening, honestly, that this is the lengths that hospitals are going to and that legislators have been going to for years. You know, this is dating back to the 80s. And there is no motivation other than capitalism behind this. And we haven't even gotten into that yet on crowning, but we should look at the history of abortion in the culture in the US, because there was a time where abortion was non controversial, where it was simply a medical procedure, where people had the freedom to be pregnant or not. And the engineering of abortion as a religious debate is just that, an engineering. This only came into play when the United States started to get into wars and the and post enslavement period, where now that it was no longer legal to enslave people in based on race alone, there had to be enslavement based on crime, which 13th Amendment, if you're not up on that, I think that was a Ava DuVernay that did the 13th was a documentary that's really accessible and a great introduction to legalized slavery. But beyond that, this idea of forcing people into birth, especially people whose children then will be pushed into something like the foster care system and adoption injuries, it's human trafficking, straight up. This is all human trafficking. And at the risk of the stream becoming a conversation dismissed as conspiracies, it's time, I think, for us to sit with this and breathe through this and to challenge um, the propaganda that's been instilled in us for since most of us were born, around moralizing abortion, moralizing even adoption, and I still experience this narrative that we should just be grateful someone chose me. I should just be grateful for what I have, and what that does is put us in a directly disempowering position to tolerate a bunch of bullshit because we, one, know other people have it worse, and two, think that um, and speaking up against these things is somehow ungrateful and threatening. So again, back to connecting that to Dolores Huerta and the story, her statement today. So this is, disturbing and something to be aware of. If you're somebody in Florida, it feels sometimes I don't I feel like I feel a duty to speak up on these things sitting safe in California while our challenges look different. We're highly surveilled. And I'm curious as to what the future will look like being in this surveillance state with a mayor that is very close with the engineers of this who have implemented different methodologies for surveilling us through technology that people eat right up, that people put cameras and um, everything, put all of these conveniences were being sold here in like the tech capital, all come at the cost of our data and our surveillance. And so that's the risk that I run. But at the same time, this going on in Florida, it just to me, if I try to speak more to solutions, and people do ask me that, like, so what's your solution? One, learning your cycle to avoid unwanted pregnancies and to be able to identify earlier on when we are pregnant so that we have more options. Because I do believe that our periods, our menses are things that we can self manage. Oftentimes, there are herbal solutions and even the medication solutions that we've looked at. I think episode 2, we looked a lot at abortion. Um, and those mailing programs, those things are accessible if we know earlier on, which is something that cycle tracking can help us with. So go to learnbodyliteracy.com. That's been linked in others. I'll link it again in the show notes after this, to begin to learn how to track your cycle. And please don't do it if you're in a state with laws like this. Please do not use an app like Flow or any free cycle tracking app, because those can also be used as evidence against you um, in courts, and they have been. And so, Learn Your Body is one app where it is secure and your data will not be at risk. And if you know of others that you can that we can look into in terms of what they do with their data, let me know. I don't think we should underestimate the severity of what's possible once this data falls in the wrong hands. So I'm a fan of handwriting this information. I think Learn Body Lit also has tracking journals available for purchase, and it's just something we need to be aware of. And on top of that, educating ourselves early on about there's nothing we could do to 100% avoid needing to be in a hospital, but there are things we can do to reduce our likelihood of these things. And um, I can't remember if we've gotten too much into home birth, but I've said before that if you work with a midwife and there does become a reason for you to transfer to the hospital, typically the midwife will transfer with you. And um, again, this is a little bit California centered and what I know about here, but I do think that is a wider thing. And I'm really interested in the fact that this story of Cherise Doyley was that she is a doula herself. And there are many, many stories that we've seen now where people speaking out are folks who are birth workers and that did everything they could to advocate for themselves, and still every force of the state was used to compel them into um, into a forced outcome that they did not consent to. So consent matters. Okay. um. All right. How's everyone doing? I am gonna go down my list here to the topic that I said we were gonna get into, and I don't really, honestly, this stuff just feels so important and relevant. But what I really wanted to talk about today um, is the evidence for transformation and our ability to participate. Hello, life affirming nectar. I'm so happy to see you here. The evidence for transformation. And so there's quite a few articles, and I think today, I feel like those topics were so intense. Um, so I'm gonna kind of do a little overview. Um, let's see here. Thank you for joining after your duel with the medical industrial complex. So far today, we've talked about Dolores Huerta's statement that she made, as well as this escalated story coming from Florida of Cherise Doyley and the forced cesarean. So, okay, I want to get into the evidence of transformation. And it all is connected because I'm thinking specifically back to Dolores Huerta's statement about um, what she thought she had to do to support the movement. And I think that silencing is something that is both learned and inherited. And I talk a lot about this as somebody socialized as a girl, socialized as an Asian girl, and what that meant for my voice and trusting my voice as well as trusting others to hear my voice and um, just speaking up for what I not only believe in, but what I needed. And so the reason I wanted to focus on the evidence of transformation today is because the birth realm, excuse me, I'm moving energy, got burps coming through. Um, the birth realm is a childbirth philosophy and method for approaching birth that is rooted in the belief that we have a inherent ability to um, and participate in our experience, and not just a belief in the ability but a belief in the necessity. And this morning I had coffee with a doula friend, and one of the things we talked about was we were talking about birth support, and specifically growing over time as doulas who have attended births where we didn't have many touch points until the client was in labor. And so for my friend, she works with an org that is contracted with our public hospital, and these people giving birth get free doulas. And so someone will be in labor and then they'll call them, and they'll send over a doula to be with them. And so this person's already active laboring, and that's their first time meeting them. And that is a pretty common scenario. And what my friend was describing is like, just like how she meets most of her clients. She's like, most of them, I'm meeting them, they're already 8 centimeters dilated. Hello, Sanctuary Studio. And for me, I was like, yeah, that reminds me of in the beginning where my orientation to doula work earlier on was a belief that I was, and it still is this, but it's evolved, but it was still rooted in this belief that I'm here to support all the wishes of my clients. And while that is still absolutely true, what I have grown in is understanding how beliefs are formed and how decisions are made. And there were several occurrences where I was working with people who were maybe budget restricted was the most common, and they thought, and they said, well, I only have this budget, and so could you be with me there for my birth? I don't need all of the prenatal support. And because I was really moving from a place of, yeah, I want to be there for what you name your needs as, I said yes, and I ended up attending several births where we had not done much prenatal preparation, and so they didn't quite prepare for their birth. I wasn't there to really understand and to support them with that outside of resources I was emailing that I couldn't assure they were truly like engaging with. And it basically just ended up with me being present for them, getting coerced through a bunch of interventions, being wheeled off to cesareans that were not medically necessary. And I was traumatized. I felt like I was just getting paid to witness somebody be coerced and pushed through the status quo. And it didn't help anybody. And so that really pushed me to think, okay, what do people really need to go into birth more empowered? And more importantly, how do people transform these fears and these lifelong beliefs shaped by propaganda that we experience through media and narratives about birth culturally, through stories of other people around them who have birthed, through even more um, you know, indifferently traumatic times. There's, people who birthed in times where they had like twilight births, where they were giving people meds that just like, I don't even know what the medication was. We'll have to look at that another time. But there was a whole era of people just being, people giving birth being tied to the bed, given some drugs so they couldn't remember any of it. And they're like screaming and being traumatized into giving birth, but they don't remember it because they were drugged. That was very common. There's also an era of people who last week we talked about episiotomies, where rather than teaching people how to breathe and maybe how to hydrate or to work with their perineum during pregnancy, instead they were just mandating episiotomies where they cut their perineum um, as a preventative thing so that they wouldn't tear. And so, anyways, all of these things have shaped how we view birth, have instilled such a deep misunderstanding and fear in birth. And I am really concerned with our ability to change that. What is within our ability to transform? And there's so much evidence on that, which is what I'm really excited to dig into. Even though it's all kind of it's all quite heady. Is that the word? So one thing I wanted to look at today was, here we go. We're going to start with this one because it's a little gentler. And this is epigenetic effects of stress. And so last week we talked about the evidence. The last 2 weeks, this is actually relevant because we talked about the evidence for doulas 2 weeks ago and the evidence for doulas supporting the immeasurable ability to reduce unwanted outcomes. And specifically, they spoke to culturally competent care being especially evidence based, that when someone giving birth has somebody who they feel seen by and just as a witness, especially someone from their own culture, that has measurable impacts in their birthing experience. And then last week, we then looked at Reiki and not only the evidence of this um, spiritual modality of laying hands, but also the evidence of it is connected to the evidence of somebody just being there, the power of co regulation, and really the measurable impact on the nervous system. And even we saw on heart rates, on blood pressure of people having hands on um, support and feeling the presence of another person that they trust. And so when we look at epigenetics, which is, let's look, what's the exact definition? I like to be specific here. So, epigenetics is the study of how behaviors and environmental factors cause changes that affect how genes work without altering the underlying DNA sequences. So, back to story and narratives. I see epigenetics often as the like story imprint on your DNA. And in fact, I really connect this to my spiritual understanding, in the sense that as somebody who channels ancestors and my own ancestors early on, my practice of ancestor work was deeply connected to this understanding of their stories living in my DNA. And so think about like, we know scientifically that we carry the DNA of our ancestors. Now think about everything they've gone through, having an imprint, like just being stamped onto this DNA through these stories. And what I believe through trance, through hypnosis, through spirit work, is that we have an ability to zone in and uncover those stories and to rewrite those stories and to free those stories. Um, and so, by the fact that we even inherit mannerisms of some, I didn't get to meet him, but my siblings, when my parent that's adopted reunited with his biological father, which was only like less than 10 years ago, my siblings told me how wild it was for um, this like biological grandfather to just like have similar like mannerisms and humor as our father. And they had literally just met for the first time. And so, if we believe that we carry patterns, inheritances, gifts, um, and even physical things. That's the most obvious one: physical traits through our DNA. That means that those that come after us will also carry our stories and our choices and our experiences in their DNA. But the cool thing is that we're getting increasing evidence that this is malleable, that we have the ability to change things, to transform things. And so, a big piece of the birth realm framework sits on the fact that, and the belief, I guess, that the evidence supported belief that we have an ability to transform our nervous systems and um, to pass on new epigenetic imprints to our children. And that can be done before getting pregnant, but it also can be done while we're pregnant. And I'll be honest, I see that with my kid. I had a highly stressed pregnancy, no emotional support, no spiritual, no like real material spiritual grounding, highly dysregulated. And I saw that in my kid the first few years. And so, with clients who've come to me prior to being pregnant, I've seen the ways that they've been able to confront different patterns that live within them and to um, birth children who experience life differently. And, it's not a complete thing. It's not I don't want to get into the ableist path that we could easily get down of like trying to give our kids like a perfect, whatever that means, body, nervous system. But there's evidence here that we can give something different. So let's see here. The word stress is often used in daily discourse to reflect the pattern of our busy lives. Um, for some, stress comes and goes, but when stress becomes chronic, usually from unresolved uncertainty, serious bodily damage can manifest. During a stressful event, neuroendocrine, cardiovascular, and emotional responses become activated and can disturb the body's normal physiological equilibrium. So, stressful events can imprint onto your body and be seen in all of these places. Over the past decade, studies have shown that chronic stress can also induce genome wide epigenetic changes in the distribution of molecules in the brain, the central organ of stress and adaptation to stress. What's more, maternal genetic changes that result from high cortisol exposure may even be passed down to future generations. And so, cortisol is often referred to as like a stress hormone. I know it's a little more complex than that, but something that we talk a lot about in birth and pregnancy preparation or pregnancy care, birth preparation is cortisol. When our cortisol spikes in labor, the contractions slow down. The body indicates, the body believes and perceives that it's not safe for a baby to be born, and oftentimes that can halt the labor. And so, our goal is to lower the cortisol, lower the stress, and to increase things like oxytocin, which induce this belief in your body that it is safe to progress, contractions can progress, and labor can continue for a safer birth experience. So here is Robert Luby. Let's see. So this whole article, like I said, I'm not going to read into everything today. This is highly medical, but this is really getting into the brain and what is happening. Um, so this is talking about stress and the disruptions, and they may cause behavioral problems in adulthood, such as impaired memory and learning anxiety and depressive like behaviors. So impaired memory is a big one under stress. People who've undergone highly stressful things can often have memory loss or not remember them. But let's read this part. The epigenetic effects of stress can also be seen within the womb. Research from 2008 suggests that maternal stress levels may affect the gestational development of a fetus in the third trimester. In this, and there are more recent studies than this, actually. In the study, a maternally depressed, anxious mood resulted in increased methylation of a CPG-rich region in the promoter and exon 1F of the GR gene in the cord blood of newborns. I am not too concerned with these details, but if you are somebody who really likes to know those like specifics, it's pretty fascinating how they can map that out. So we'll just shout out the part of treatment options to be generative today. So patients suffering from chronic stress should be encouraged to improve their sleep quality and quantity, improve social support, aka doulas, as we saw in the doula evidence, but that is anybody calling a friend, um, having supportive partners, promote a positive outlook on life, maintain a healthy diet, avoid smoking, and undertake regular moderate physical activity. They also utilize tools as IFM diet, nutrition, lifestyle journal. Okay, this is a functional, again, looking critically at our sources. This one is from the Institute for Functional Medicine. So they have all of their solutions are going to be related to that. Um, this article is looking at implications on hypnotherapy. So neuroplasticity, that is think about your brain having like plastic that's like able to change and move and bounce. I even heard there was a study on after a traumatic event, the to play Tetris. Have y'all heard of this? There was a study to play Tetris after a traumatic event, like a car accident, something that's like a big jolt. Yeah, think of your brain like flubber. Love it. Um, the ability for your brain to change. And so there was a study that playing Tetris after keeps the neuroplasticity, keeps things moving. There's something in that simple little game, which I loved playing Tetris as a kid, which makes sense because I was traumatized. Okay, pain. So, hypnosis can be an effective treatment for stress, anxiety, and pain. Hypnosis can change functional connectivity and neuroplasticity. Hypnosis may be associated with epigenetic changes, and hypnosis-induced changes may underlie hypnosis. Huh? Hypnosis-induced epigenetic changes may underlie hypnosis-induced changes in neuroplasticity. So they're connecting here our neuroplasticity with our epigenetics and our DNA, which to me, as somebody who's been uncovering over these years this practice of, and as a reminder, I've been studying hypnosis. That's why I brought this in. It started with Reiki. We now see how that's evidence-based to transform the perceptions of pain and anxiety for people. That being deepened through this, and honestly, truthfully, this came to me mostly intuitively in the beginning, and my approach is kind of like I feel like I receive a message from spirit, and then I'm kind of guided to the right articles and evidence, which some might call confirmation bias, but it works. That's why I show you the sources that I'm reading so you can decide what you trust. Um, and so hypnosis has been used to manage diverse types of pain since centuries and across different cultures. Although hypnosis has been controversial and is currently not a part of mainstream clinical practices, there's increasing evidence that hypnosis can indeed be an effective, non pharmacological, and cost effective method for the treatment of various health conditions like pain, anxiety, mood disorders, sleep problems, stress associated with medical and surgical procedures, cancer treatment related side effects, or irritable bowel syndrome. And all of these things up to here and maybe even further are things that we see in pregnancy and postpartum. And so for overall wellness, obviously that shit doesn't go away when you're pregnant. If you dealt with that prior to, this is why I like to introduce this early on to people who may even be years away from actual conception, because I mentioned earlier through tracking your cycle, and I'm a big fan of cycle tracking, including your moods, including beyond just, there's the three symptoms we've looked at, or the three signs of fertility that we've looked at before, which are your cervical positioning, your cervical fluid, and your resting temperature when you first wake, aka your basal body temperature. Um, but there's so much more that can tell us, and this is connected to our hormones, connected to our brain functioning, and through this evidence now connected to our DNA. Let's see what she got here. Read an article on infants under 1 year who had to get brain surgery that removed part of their brain that is traditionally linked to language acquisition, and then their other brain part just took over and they can still learn languages. That's fascinating. The brain is so cool. Sorry to yell, but I just love it. Yeah, that's really interesting. And this is where, again, I get into like expanding that. Like, nature is disabled, nature is trans. Like, our ability to adapt and and our other senses to enhance and like move, like, to me it's so inspiring because it helps me believe in change. It helps me believe that transformation is an inevitable um, opportunity available to us. And I just really, really need that belief in this world right now. I need to believe that we have the ability um, to change. So this is looking into hypnosis and how it relates to pain, to chronic pain. And hypnosis has already been utilized uh, in the birth world for the purpose of navigating childbirth. I'm not sure since when. When did hypnobirthing start? 1989. Oh yeah, Marie Monken. So again, hypnosis. These are also, to me, this is also evidence to dig into indigenous orientations to navigating change and birthing. Um, these are, in some ways, I've said this before, I don't like to overly rely on and like say that like this is why it's real just because we have studies and evidence, but it is nice in a colonized world to see that indigenous ways of birthing and being are in fact evidence-based and need to be included in the evidence-based conversation. I think earlier in my doula practice, I held a little bit more of a separation between discussing things that are evidence-based and things that are ancestral. And the fact is that they're both, because indigenous people have been innovating and it's always been science. It just was recorded and passed on in different ways that and also erased, obviously. So I will say, where I like to take it a little bit step further is that um, hypnosis, gives us, as my teacher Desiree Eckert calls it, it's simply the state of focused autonomy. And in fact, the person who, oh, I don't have it on hand, my little notebook. The person who created the term hypnosis, by the end of his life or career, wanted to call it something different. What did he want to call it again? He wanted to call it monoideism. He reproposed by the end of, he coined James Braid, um, Braid or Baird, the surgeon who coined hypnosis, later wanted to change the name to monoideism, because he originally thought it was taking you into a state of sleep, and that's why the hypnosis is like, you are getting sleepy, very sleepy. And later he learned and was like, oh, actually, it's bringing them to what Desiree calls a state of focused autonomy. It is monoideism. It is bringing our brain into a state where, instead of processing a million things at once, we can be hyper focused. And what I love about that, and so hypnobirthing emerged, and now there's also hypno babies. There's all these shoot offs of it. And where I want to evolve, where I feel called with the birth realm, is to say that, yes, this is a evidence-based form of pain management, and it's also spiritual traveling. It's also spiritual. It is inherently spiritual and connected to another realm. This trance state that we're in, if we are, I even think about it as magic school bus, like transporting into our DNA and watching the movie that lives in our DNA, this rich imaginative world of symbolism that we can access by our through our state of focused autonomy into the stories that lie in our DNA, where we can actively participate in them, shape them, influence them, release them. And in that sense, I like to see my work as time travel. So, might have lost y'all there, how we went from all of these sciencey words on here into time travel, but that is what the birth realm is. I do think I've had sessions where I'm traveling into when people were born themselves, and one of the most fascinating sessions I had one time was for someone who I I went into the energy work, and what I saw was a version of themselves that didn't really want me up in their energy, but instead, where they directed me was to their moment of birthing. And instead of being doing the energy work in their body, doing the energy work on their mother's body and relieving their mother. And that has happened quite a few times, and I see that as sometimes spirit directing, because time is not linear. There's all these multi dimensions. um, I see that as an ability to kind of time travel back into influencing um, their imprint of when they came into the world, because of this evidence we see that connects, um, the maternal stress experience to the fetus. So hopefully I didn't lose you there. I got really excited by that tangent. But all of these studies that I've pulled today are just continuing to affirm this connection between mother or gestational parent and baby. Um, the way the belief that your experiences through pregnancy, especially, but also even prior, um, can and will imprint into these epigenetic biomarkers. And in this study, they did it by looking at their DNA in their saliva, and they screened 728 pregnant people for stress exposure. And let's see, conclusions. Genes annotated were found to be involved in secretion and transportation, nuclear signaling, which is hippocampus in your brain, signaling pathways. I'm not going to go into all these words, but you know, let's see. Moreover, some are annotated to genes related to autism, PTSD, and schizophrenia. However, our results should be viewed as hypothesis generating until replicated in a larger sample. Early assessment of such non invasive PS biomarkers will allow timelier detection of babies at risk and a more effective allocation of resources for early intervention programs to improve child development. A biomarker guided early intervention strategy is the first step in the prevention of future health problems, reducing their personal and societal impact. And so I appreciate that. I appreciate that this is handled with care, because I always want to be sure that when we're talking about things like this, autism, PTSD, and schizophrenia, we know there are connections to genetics and the mother. Now we've also talked about our ability to change that. And so I also just really want to emphasize that what I'm not saying is that we should be focusing on hypnosis and stress as to prevent these things, and never ever um, wanting to send the message that this is stuff that should be our motivation to do these things, is to avoid that. And I've said it on prior streams, and I'll say it again, that if you're not prepared for the possibility of a disabled child, then don't get pregnant or manage your pregnancy earlier on, because everyone is always at risk of becoming disabled, whether it's in utero or elsewhere. So I feel like I'm going to leave it at that today, because the evidence is here. There is a study I will link that looks at one of the most cited and referenced studies about epigenetics was done looking at third generation Jewish Holocaust survivors. And so that's a really interesting study to read if you're curious about that, and the measurable things that we know through people who survive something so horrific, with survivors that we've been able to follow and learn from and track in that way. So, yeah, um, we have power, we have inheritances, and this place here, why I always focus on birthing as a portal to that power, is because I never want what we've inherited to limit us. And I also believe that there's so much we can do with what is currently available to us in this moment, um, just through our presence, through our imaginations, through our focus autonomy, as Desiree has said. And so I if you're not familiar with the birth realm method, and the reason why we've been looking at all of these studies is because where I've where I believe I'm um, expanding from what is widely accepted in the birthing world as the Mongan method, hypnobirthing, hypnobabies, is I find, and I have what I've learned about those, and there certainly might be other practitioners that see it differently, but a lot of it is um, moving past the language of pain. It intends to um, pacify through the experience of laboring and childbirth, through the imagination. And I think what can get lost sometimes is the more fun belief that I have that this is literally you traveling into that world, and it's not just a conjuring based on pop culture media that you've watched, and it is shaped and influenced by that. Our brain does borrow imagery from that, and those people that come through when you're in the birth realm, I believe, are representations of your ancestors. I believe that the spirits whose stories live in the spirits of those whose stories live in our DNA, they work with this. I see them working through this like library of images available to them to come forward to us and to share stories with us. And I think this is the power of symbolism, of myth, the power of even looking at our dreams and beginning to learn your language that your body is communicating with you. When you dig in and explore and let yourself be open and curious about the possibilities, and like the magical uh, infinite expansiveness of what you are able to imagine, um, the same part of your brain, something I learned in hypnosis is that the same part of our brain processes our real experiences with what things that aren't real. And so the same part of our brain processes lived and imagined things, and therefore, according to our brain, um, both are real. And so that's why you can jump at a movie, and I've been teased, and because I am so immersed in like when I'm in Midori and I were in Hawaii, there's this thing at the arcade where you're like in this virtual reality, and I'm there. I'm jumping, I'm like scared, I'm emotional because the part of my brain is like, this is real. I don't know if she's imagining it or if this is it's happening to us. And so, with that said, especially if you're pregnant, to my pregnant one in the chat, then be mindful of the media you're consuming, and not just mindful. You can consume any type of media, but just be mindful that that will be processed in the same part of your body and can have impacts. And so maybe if you watch something intense, can maybe play some Tetris, or continue to work with that neuroplasticity, or work with your own imagination. Sometimes when I watch scary movies, I literally just imagine that I'm putting a veil that's like, okay, none of this energy can come forward and reach me. Because I need to imagine this buffer so that none of it lands in my body when I'm watching like really intense, wild stuff. So, the power of our imagination is so cool. I'm emotional too. I feel so much better now. If you were here from the start, I literally borderline cried because of just how passionate I feel around the choices that we've had to make, the choices that many of us have felt we had to make in order to keep our children safe And I want to offer up a different way of empowering ourselves through our voices, through our inner worlds, through our connection with our spirits and ancestors that I fully believe is supported through evidence such as that which we looked at today. The evidence of epigenetics, the evidence and the connection between our DNA and our neuroplasticity, our ability to engage with that, our ability ultimately to co create. And so, shout out to our creative power. And may we all continue to rise and expand into our creative sovereignty and our ability to be co creators in our experiences, and birth and build our worlds. So, thanks for being with me. Love to every one of you, especially in the chat. And I will see you next Wednesday on Crowning. Bye.